Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Sangeeta Gopalakrishnan, and I am the Director of Online Programs for the College of Education here at the University of Illinois. And we're really happy you joined us for this presentation. I'm going to hand over the session to Nicholas Burbulis, who, as I was saying, needs no introduction, but I requested him to introduce himself and then start.
Thanks, Sangeeta, and thanks everyone for coming. I'm going to start my, I'm going to share my screen here in a second. Hang on. No, not yet. One second. There we go. Well, I'm trying to share my screen.
No problem. Did you want me to do it?
No, I've got it. Thank you.
Okay.
Can everybody see it now?
Yes, I can.
Okay,
Yes.
great. Okay, so let me start by giving you sort of a preview of this talk. So first of all, I want to say that my co-author in this paper is Irish Farley, one of our EDD students. She really did a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of the actual lit review, reviewing, organizing, and summarizing the major studies in this area. I probably wrote most of the text, but I wanted her to be the first author on this paper. Why am I doing this? Why did I do this project? Well, as I think everybody here knows, I've been teaching a long time. I was one of the first faculty in the college to develop and teach online courses. And I've been doing it a long time. I think I'm pretty good at it. They're highly rated classes. My students really praise my classes. But I've been troubled, and probably increasingly troubled in recent years, by the fact that certain groups of students don't do as well in my classes. Particularly undergraduates tend not to do as well. Members of some underrepresented groups tend not to do as well. And I'm troubled when I look at the grading patterns at the end of the class and see certain groups overrepresented in the lower grades of the class. Now, I will confess that there's a part of me, that the sort of the tough love part of me, that thinks, well, I'm very clear about the expectations of the class. I tell people, for example, that they have to read and they have to post in the discussion forum. If people don't do that, well, that's on them. And that's one side of me, one side of my brain. The other side of my brain is that I want every student to be successful in my classes, all my classes. I tell my students regularly, I'll give everybody an A, happily, if everybody does their best in the class. It doesn't work out that way, but I don't have a curve. I don't grade students relative to each other. I grade them relative to the expectations of the class. And it just, and so if some students are, and particularly certain groups of students, are consistently having trouble with my class expectations, at what point do I have to think about not what's on them, but what's on me? And what there might be inadvertently in the design and organization of the class that I think is treating everybody equally and fairly, but that in fact maybe is putting some students at a disadvantage. And so I wanted to do a sort of research-based literature review on what we know about who succeeds and who doesn't succeed in the online environment, why, and what can be done about it. And that's what this presentation is about. Everybody who follows this knows that one of the major slogans for online education, for as long as we've been doing it, is that it's a means of expanding access to educational opportunities to a wide range and variety of students. I do think it has that potential. But if there's something structural in the online experience that is disadvantaging to certain groups, then we should be concerned about that. Certainly I'm concerned about that. And as I said, that's the starting point of this study. So title of the presentation, you can all read it. I hate people who read slides, but the key point here is looking at online education through an equity lens. So one thing I want to talk about is what I call structural impediments. It's not the main topic of this class, but everybody who's taught online knows that some students are already at a disadvantage because they don't have access to quality technology. They don't always have a quiet place to log in to the class. Some students are in a quiet room with headphones and good Wi-Fi connectivity, and obviously a nice computer and monitor and good video camera. Other students are on a bus somewhere interacting through their phone. Now you can say it's the same class for everybody, but it's not the same class for everybody. The environment, the student who's in a quiet place in class and another student who's in a room with two kids running around in the background and a TV on somewhere. Social support. What happens if something doesn't work technically? Does somebody have someone there that they can help locally in their home that they can ask to help them, or somebody to check the Wi-Fi or whatever? People's academic preparation and the different levels of academic preparation. I'm going to say more about this in a second. And what's important about this is that these factors clearly affect some groups more than others. Relative economic security or insecurity is clearly a factor. Environmental factors are clearly a factor. Where you live, rural students who maybe don't have access to high quality, high bandwidth Wi-Fi, et cetera. These are themselves disadvantaging factors for certain groups of students. This is not the main topic of my talk because by and large, most of these things, poverty, economic inequality, housing issues, family environment, are really outside the frame of what faculty can remedy. These are much larger social and economic and political concerns of inequality in our society. But one thing that instructors can do is they can be aware of these differences. During COVID, for example, the university loaned out free laptops to students to make sure that everybody had access to at least a minimal level of technology access, technical access to the classes. But what these factors highlight for the instructor is that while you think you're sending out the same class to all your students, they're not all experiencing the same class. And that factors on their side, technical factors, as I said, environmental factors, social factors, and others create at their end, can create at their end, a highly unequal access to the learning opportunities. And so it's important to be aware of these structural impediments, to try to compensate for them where you can. But as I said, these are not primarily the factors that are of concern for me in this talk today. I do want to talk about what I call instructional impediments. Core factors of the course design, it's the online course design itself, and aspects of how one actually teaches material in an online environment. Those are the two main headings of this presentation, and how those factors themselves can create unequal or inequitable learning opportunities. So let me just summarize, based on the research, what we know about some of what I'm calling instructional impediments that students face in the online environment. There's a range of factors that limit their learning and engagement. Different groups of students report varying degrees of satisfaction with the online learning environment. And while I'm a strong proponent of believing that very high level, high quality online teaching is possible, many students, for various reasons, don't experience the online environment as a healthy, comfortable learning space. And if they don't, that is something that we should be taking into consideration as online instructors. Many students reflect a higher level of anxiety and insecurity as students, as learners in the online medium. They might be generally confident about their abilities as learners generally, but they're not comfortable and they're not secure in the online medium. It's not a major factor of this presentation, but one of the things we learned during COVID, and we're still dealing with the aftermath of not COVID itself, but the rapid transition to online, mandatory online because of COVID. We've seen a significant uptick in student mental health issues. And I know on this campus, particularly, this remains a major concern. And some of even as we start to return back to at least a hybrid mixed learning environment, many of these social and mental health issues continue to be a problem for many students. A third factor students report is that they don't feel socially connected with the other students in the class or with the instructor. Related to that they don't feel that they're part of a community of inquiry that is actively and cooperatively learning together. There's absolutely something about sitting in a room alone, staring at your computer laptop. We've all done this with hours and hours and hours of Zoom meetings, where in some cases, you do feel a strong connection to the other people. In other cases, it can be extremely alienating. And I'll just use that word, alienating, to be in a learning environment where you don't feel a strong connection to the other students or to the instructor. A lack of what's often called culturally responsive content or culturally appropriate content. If you're a member of a particular racial or ethnic or gender group, whatever it might be, how does it feel to encounter a class where all the readings are from people who aren't part of your particular group? Just to take an example, you're a woman, but all the readings in the class are by men, and the professor's a man. How does that reinforce or exacerbate the problem about not being socially or personally connected to the course learning environment and the course material? There's a lot of research that shows that students in the online environment require greater structure, more teacher attention, more explicit and overt feedback than many online classes provide. I sometimes call online teaching directed independent study, because a good deal of the online courses requires a pretty high degree of what I'm going to call self-management on the side of students. They have to do the readings, they have to remember to post in the discussion forums, etc. They have to schedule their time, and because of the nature of the online environment, they often have to schedule their time between synchronous and asynchronous activities. In some cases, that also might include time zone differences, depending on what part of the world they live in. For all these reasons, the online environment requires a greater degree of structure and feedback and overt explanation of course requirements than many faculty routinely offer. And as I say in the last point, many of the factors I've mentioned are reinforced by a lack of academic background. Writing skills, for example, are highly varying between different students, and writing skills matter in every kind of class, but they especially matter in the online environment where posting to the discussion forum or other things require a certain degree of facility and comfort in expressing oneself verbally in text. But also what I've called before learning skills or self-management skills. Some people call them executive functions. I don't really like that word. I'm going to call them self-management skills. How you organize your time, how you maintain a schedule that allows you to keep up with course requirements and course expectations. That's an area in which different students, for a variety of reasons, have a very high degree of difference in terms of their preparation, and which matter for any kind of class, any kind of university class, but I think especially matter for the online environment, where these abilities to organize your time, recognize and keep up with course expectations puts a particular burden on the student to monitor and track what they're expected to do and to make sure that they actually do it. And I'm going to come back to each of these factors, what I'm calling impediments, in terms of things that we can do, either in terms of course design and or in terms of instructional interventions to directly address and remedy these impediments. So let's talk about the course design elements, and then I'll talk about the instructional elements, and then I'll stop and we can have more of a give and take and conversation here. So here are research supported best practices in online course design. Many of you are familiar with many of these. Some of them are just good principles of course design generally, but for the reasons I've mentioned, some of them in particular are particularly important for online course design. A simple and clear user interface that is easy to navigate. One of the things that this campus was concerned about for a while is that different faculty were using different learning management systems. And between classes and other expectations, on top of everything else students were having to manage, they were also having to manage different learning management systems that impose different kinds of requirements in terms of learning and becoming comfortable with the specific features and affordances of each one. And so a simple, clear interface that allows students to, for example, organize their calendar of their different classes in one platform is highly to be preferred from needing to switch constantly back and forth, not only between different courses and different instructors, different sets of expectations, but also different LMSs and just simply the interface itself. Clear expectations. Clear expectations are certainly a feature of best practice for course design generally, but given the impediments I just mentioned, it's particularly important to be really clear with students about the expectations of the class in the syllabus, in the learning management system, in one's lectures and reminders periodically, even in some cases having to follow up with individual students. Hey, I noticed you haven't posted in the discussion forum for the last couple of weeks. You know, remember that this is a course requirement. We want to see you active in this space. Sometimes I have to admit that I'm a little reluctant to do this, especially with graduate courses. I keep thinking these are graduate courses. People shouldn't have to be reminded of these things, but people clearly do need to be reminded of these things. And again, certain groups particularly, I think, just the research is suggesting, I'm thinking about undergraduates, for example, need much more overt and clear expectations and reminders. Highly active and adaptive learning tasks. This is one of the things that helps to promote engagement. I was doing observations on teaching for a faculty member a while back in their online class. They had excellent PowerPoints, but they spoke almost constantly for the 2 hours of their online class. They covered a ton of material, but I have to admit, I don't think that's good online pedagogy. Students need things that they're doing that involve actively responding, thinking, problem solving, etc., both in the individual class activities, but also in terms of the assignments or projects that they're working on. A really key concept in the literature, some of you are probably familiar with this, is the idea of social presence. One of the reasons in which some students don't feel particularly connected to the class is that they don't see other students don't see them. This is frankly reinforced when they are different from the majority of the students in other ways anyhow. Some students choose not to turn on their video cameras, and I give them the right not to choose not to do that. But the consequence is if someone is simply looking at a bunch of blank tiles on the screen and they can't see the other students and the other students can't see them, this is something that undermines the idea of social presence. So conscious activities in the live class sessions, in the assignments, in the discussion forums that promote actual presence and visibility of each student as an individual student with their own identities and views and positions, where they're from, where they work, etc., are really important to this sense of students really feeling that they're part of or belong in a class. Again, this can be a factor in any sort of class. It's a particularly important factor in online classes. This relates directly to the next point: developing specific intentional strategies to promote social connection and engagement, both between the students and you as the instructor, and among the students themselves. These have to be consistent, intentional, and actively promoted in terms of how you get students talking with each other in a synchronous session and not just listening, for example, to your lecture. Point I just mentioned, picking culturally relevant and intellectually challenging course material is something that clearly promotes students' feeling of connection and engagement with the class at all. I'm a big fan of blended synchronous and asynchronous course design. I know there are some people who believe that we should go entirely asynchronous, and there are arguments for doing that. Many universities have gone fully asynchronous with their classes. The reason I believe that the blended model is important, and there's research to support this, is because there are specific things that you can do in the synchronous modality, especially around social presence, engaging students with each other and with the instructor directly and spontaneously and in a sort of live fashion that just isn't the same in a totally asynchronous discussion or modality. For me, the best model is a blend of the two, but I understand that there are issues. For example, as I said, time zone difference issues and others, people's work schedules with having a synchronous element in the class. Instructionally, I think it's important to have multiple channels and multiple different approaches. Some students just thrive more in the synchronous environment. Other students thrive much more in the asynchronous environment. In view of that fact, we should try to maintain both. And finally, the research suggests the adoption of the UDL, Universal Design for Learning principles. I have a daughter with disabilities, and actually she and I are working on a paper together about how people misunderstand UDL. A lot of people think of UDL as sort of code language for accommodating people with disabilities. If you look at the literature and the materials on Universal Design for Learning, the key word there is universal. These are principles to promote successful learning by all different kinds of students and accommodating many different kinds of differences and learning differences, not only issues of literal disability. Plus, as I think everybody here knows, issues of disability often interact with other categories or other kinds of groups of students. So disability issues are not just that group of students. Sometimes disability issues relate to many, many different kinds of students in one way or another. And to me, the basic core of UDL that I find, and I've just articulated this, it's one of my basic principles generally about online education, is that the main virtue of new technologies is that it allows us to develop, to teach through multiple modalities, multiple pathways of learning, of communicating, of interacting between students and the professor, among the students, and we can use technology to undermine the typical one-size-fits-all modality of the typical classroom that doesn't serve. I mean, while I love the classroom, that modality does not serve all students equally well. One of my big gripes about online education is the tendencies of certain programs to converge on single unitary course design, when to me, one of the main benefits of these technologies is to allow experimentation and diversification among multiple different modalities, multiple ways of presenting material, multiple ways of lecturing, multiple kinds of things that you can read or watch videos, multiple ways in which students can participate, again, in synchronous or in asynchronous modalities vis-a-vis the instructor or vis-a-vis one another. And so to me, the key principle of Universal Design for Learning is using technology to allow multiple different ways of students to access the material and giving them some control and them some choice in how they access material relative to their own needs, their own interests, and their own learning differences. It's a correction to the one-size-fits-all model. And it really bothers me, frankly, when online instruction simply incorporates a new kind of one-size-fits-all model, when the whole point is that we have the resources now to diversify and open up and multiply our different pathways for teaching and learning. The other final list of items has to do with, so the first set was about course design. This somewhat overlapping category has to do more specifically with things instructors can do, what I'm calling instructional interventions to encourage student engagement and success. One of the things I think that we should do a lot more, either in the class or even possibly before the class, is to offer an explicit online orientation session. Maybe it's only one session that says you're about to take an online class. Maybe this is your first online class. This is not like any class you've ever taken before. And here are some things that you need to know on your side about how you're going to need to adapt and change some of your habits to be successful in the online or learning environment. And then providing 6 or 8 or 10 guidelines or bits of advice for students who are new to the online medium and don't realize that it requires, as I think I've tried to make quite clear in this presentation, a different kind of approach to one's teaching and learning, including these important issues that I was calling earlier self-management, that some people call executive function. And I think an explicit orientation before the class even starts to say, let's bring everybody up to the same level. Some of you have taken a lot of online classes before. For some of you, this is your first online class. Let's make sure that we have a common background about what the requirements and expectations are to be successful in the online environment itself. And I believe that that sort of online orientation should be mandatory for online students if they haven't taken an online class before. Second, I think that there are a lot of things that the instructor needs to do to enhance and promote student academic self-confidence and self-concept. Go back to the point I made earlier. Many of your students are already nervous and insecure in the online environment. It's not about you, it's about them. And they might need a greater need of encouragement, personal attention, hands-on advice, maybe office hours or one-to-one interactions to help them start to feel comfortable and secure in the online learning environment and in your class in specific. You can't take it for granted. And for reasons I think I don't need to belabor, that lack or uncertain academic self-concept is going to affect certain kinds of groups of students more than others. To take another piece of evidence from the research, often older students, even students who have been academically successful themselves in other settings, are not confident in the online environment. We need to be aware of it, and we need to anticipate it, and we need to be responsive to it. Establishing rapport and a set of connections. I don't think I'm the funniest person in the world. Certainly my family would tell you I'm, what do they call it? Dad jokes. I'm the master of dad jokes. I get a lot of groans around the house. But whether it's through humor or telling personal stories or anecdotes, do things that make yourself a live person for the students and allow them some latitude in the chat or in the discussion forum to also share these more personal elements of who they are. It's a key part of their social presence, and it's a key part of what the research calls teacher presence. You are just a talking head on a video screen to a lot of students. And being present to them, giving them a sense that you are aware of them as individuals, concerned about them, and committed to their success is a really important atmospheric matter that you just can't take for granted. And you might be giving great lectures, and you might really know your stuff, and you might be, a very skilled lecturer, but the online environment also requires some attention to these more affective and social dimensions, both from your side and also from the student side. And part of your job as an online instructor, based on the research, is to be more attentive and, again, intentional about creating this emotional and social space among your students, both in terms of how you interact with them and how you encourage them to interact with each other. Part of explicit expectations is frequent, timely feedback and check-ins. If someone hasn't posted in the forum for a couple of weeks, as I've mentioned, I have to sort of push the tough love voice off my shoulder and say, it's on me to reach out to that student and say, we haven't heard from you lately. What's going on? Is there anything I can help you with? We miss your perspective and your voice. The things that really make it clear to them that A, you notice, and B, that you care. Mentoring, student advising generally is always important for instructors. In any class, it's especially important in the online environment because often the struggles that a particular student is encountering, it could be true in a regular class as well, but especially in an online class, the struggles they're encountering may be entirely invisible to you if you don't seek them out and give them a chance to talk with you about it. Virtual office hours are really important. Some of this is on them to come meet with you, but it's also really important to make it clear to your students that you are available and that you actively want to have this time to interact with them. And just underscoring a point that I've already mentioned, this affective dimension really matters to students. In a regular classroom, there's face contact, there's eye contact, there's body language, there's all the ways in which an instructor can express concern or sensitivity or attention to individual students in the class. There are, in some cases, online equivalents to those things. In other cases, there really isn't a direct online equivalent. And you have to be, again, more explicit and more intentional about making sure that your students know that you really do care about them, that you really do want them to succeed, and that you haven't just plunged them into a sink or swim environment. That's the talk. Let's see, a little over half an hour. That's the talk. Those are the guidelines. Some of them are my own sort of strongly held opinions, but this outline is all based on research-based principles that the literature review part of the paper, and I can send you a link. The paper has now appeared in print if you want to read the full paper, but and get the research background of some of these. But this is not just my opinion, although I do have strong feelings about some of them. These are really the best principles and the best practices that we developed based on our survey of the literature. And I will, in fact, post the URL in the chat in a second while we're talking. And now I will stop talking and turn this more into a Q&A and discussion. Okay, so I will try to adopt my best online pedagogy. I've not been following the chat. Is there anything in the chat that I need to be monitoring?
No,
I didn't want to ask the first question, but given that no one else has, I will. You know, and you'll know this is a theme of mine, that one of my and the work that Mary and I, one of our critiques is of the affordances of learning management systems. So we've kind of parsed these things very well. And I think, oh no, not very well, extensively. We spend a lot of time parsing them. And we do that with our students as well. And the interesting thing about all the learning management systems we have at the moment, you know, they're all essentially the same architecture. And the things that you've identified, I mean, I think the really important point you've identified is about social presence, and also about self-management. I agree, that's a much more palatable concept than self-efficacy, which is a little bit mechanical in its implications. You know, I think there are two things that the current model of learning management systems is particularly poor about. So, you know, so the architecture of learning management systems is essentially hub and spoke. You know, you're the professor, you're putting up lectures, you're whatever, and the social stuff is marginal. It's comments on the side where people mix up all sorts of, you know, different orders of things, and it's the social stuff is not systematically structured into learning management systems. So in a sense, we're victims of that affordance. On the self-management side, you know, they still mostly operate on long cycle summative assessments, so you don't really know how you're going. And in these environments now where there's learning analytics, there's AI supported stuff, as well as ways of aggregating social feedback, They really fall down on this front, I think, in the area of learning analytics. And it's essentially because of their underlying technical architectures, but also their pedagogical architectures. So that's a rather long-winded way of saying to me, look, I think you've put the nail on the head on the nail of the hammer with the issues of presence, social presence, and self-management. But aren't these things which learning management systems are not good at, and why don't we revolt, kind of thing?
Yeah. Well, I think a different paper, a good one, would be a sort of critique of learning management systems in terms of how well they do or don't reflect some of these best practices. I will give a little pitch to Scholar, your application. I think that it is particularly strong on the collaboration and building social connections among students. I think it does a really good job of that. I haven't seen the latest version, but as you know, I followed its development since almost the very beginning. And I agree with you. The other LMSs are extremely homogeneous in terms of their basic look, feel, and functions. And given the principle that I mentioned, that we should be diversifying our technological pathways and not settling in a one-size-fits-all. The learning management system, I did have I had a doctoral advisee who did a comparative analysis of different LMSs, including Scholar, and they're extremely homogeneous. And I think the infrastructure matters. It's what I sometimes call the groove. That is, you tend to fit your instruction into the groove of what the LMS wants you to do. Sometimes you can adapt it or modify it or even break the LMS and do something different. But for the typical user, we tend to follow the path of least resistance. And what that means is an even greater degree of conformity and standardization, which, as I've said now several times, to me is exactly what technology should be allowing us to transform and to overcome. Let's diversify our approaches and not just. So I want many LMSs. I don't just want one, and I don't want 5 that all basically look like the same thing. That's not diversification either.
Thanks, Nick.
So if nobody else has a question, I'm wondering, Nick, you already spoke about this a little bit, where you said many of what we want, what we say are best practices for online course design and online instructor interventions are also common to face-to-face. We should be doing this in the face-to-face teaching environment as well. Can you talk a little bit more about something? I know you said the affective is something very special to online, or we need to focus more on the affect aspect in the online environment, that the teacher has to be more intentional about conveying that they care or that they're a human being and not just sending out course announcements or just a thumbnail on a Zoom screen. Are there anything else, other aspects that you think are more specific to the online environment and different from the face-to-face environment?
Well, so let me say a couple of things about that. So first of all, this is something I've been saying a long time. Because I've been around since the very beginning of this reform, I remember the debates about, quote, which is better, the online environment or the on-campus environment, and there was a huge fight about which was better. Almost from the very beginning, I've been saying that's the wrong question. Because we're familiar with the on-campus in-person environment, it is the modality that we all experienced, and it's where we, at least pre-COVID, where most of us did most of our teaching. We accept that as sort of the natural, normal option. I think one of the things about teaching online, one of the things that's done for me, is it's made me aware of the fact that the on-campus in-person environment is itself biased towards the success or failure of different kinds of students. We think of it as sort of the natural ideal of teaching, to which online is an insufficient, inadequate copy. But I think the more accurate picture is each modality has strengths, each modality has shortcomings, and there are a lot of things about the typical classroom that actually are experienced as uncomfortable and disadvantaging by many students. And that if that was the only modality, we'd be putting some students at a disadvantage there. And I think, the more we think about this, it isn't which is better, but what are the specific strengths and weaknesses and affordances of each? And in my map, how do we take advantage of both in a way that creates an environment that increases, again, the pathways, the options available to students, with an eye towards providing broader access and broader success to a diverse range of students, as opposed to saying, this is the way this class is taught, get used to it, and get on board with this particular structure or form of pedagogy. And if you're not comfortable with it, then get comfortable with it. We all know that certain students don't speak up as much in a class. In a live class, the ones who raise their hands the fastest, or who are the most confident and most assertive, often dominate the discussion. And again, we all know this from our teaching, certain groups of students from certain backgrounds, sometimes certain cultural or even national backgrounds, don't speak up as much in the classroom. Those students often blossom in the online environment because now they can express themselves in text. They don't have to be the first ones to raise their hands because it's asynchronous. They can write their comments and edit them and reread them. And then when they're comfortable, push send, as opposed to feeling like they have to say it quickly and perfectly the first time. And for all these reasons, many students who don't do well in the regular classroom thrive in the online environment. So why are we forced to choose between them? If different students do well in different kinds of modalities, then let's combine those modalities, live, online, synchronous, asynchronous, technology supported, personal and face-to-face, because we know that different students are going to feel more comfortable and going to be more successful in some of those media than others. To me, as I said before, that to me is the main message of universal design for learning. Don't think that all students are going to learn and study and engage in a class in the same way. Use technology to multiply and diversify these pathways. I did post the paper link in the chat. It's in the Review of Education, which is the main journal of the British Educational Research Association, BERA. It was published in earlier this month, October 2nd, 2022. If you want to look it up yourself, but the link is in the chat. Okay, super, great. Thank you very much. I hope this was helpful. Sangeetha, thanks for setting this up. I appreciate the opportunity.
Oh, thank you so much, Nick. I will share the recording once it gets processed.
Good, outstanding. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.